This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 143, Jack and Jennifer Edwards, Part 2. In the last episode, I told you the first part of the story of 15-year-old Jack Edwards and his 13-year-old sister, Jennifer. I told you about the multiple romantic partners and children their father, John Edwards, abused and manipulated over the years, the various complaints against John of domestic violence and stalking, and how, despite all that, he was able to obtain permits and licenses to both shoot and own multiple firearms in New South Wales, Australia. In this episode, I'll tell you about how John Edwards' diabolical preparations led up to his most horrific act, how he carried out the brutal murder of Jack and Jenny on July 5, 2018, the devastation John left in his wake, and how the incredibly thorough coroner's inquest into this terrible crime exposed the failures of the systems and individuals who could have prevented it. This is part 2 of the infuriating story of Jack and Jennifer Edwards. I'll take a second up top to thank my newest patrons, Lauren J. from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Jennifer from Swansea, Massachusetts. Thank you both and welcome. I appreciate you so much. To make a pledge, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. I also want to give a special thanks to Maria M. for your support on Ko-fi. If you haven't yet listened to episode 142, which was part 1 of Jack and Jennifer's story, you should definitely do that before you listen to this one, or a lot of details won't make sense. I'd also like to apologize if the way I referred to John's previous partners and children in the last episode was confusing. Their names were protected under Australian law, so I referred to them the same way they were addressed in the coroner's inquest, Ms. A, Ms. B, and so on. I felt like I needed a diagram to keep track of them all. Again, this story deals with some very dark and possibly triggering topics, including domestic violence, coercive control, narcissistic abuse, failures at multiple levels of government, suicide, family annihilation, gun violence, and child murder. If it gets too heavy, remember to hit pause and take a break. With that, let's move on to part 2 of Jack and Jenny's story. As you may remember from the last episode, between August and October of 2017, John visited the Horsley Park gun shop 3 times and purchased 3 rifles and ammunition. After the 6-month waiting period to purchase handguns expired, John then went to the same gun shop twice more between March and April of 2018. During the first visit, he bought a .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver. During the second, he purchased a Glock 17A semi-automatic 9mm pistol and ammunition. In April of 2018, as he had done in January, John showed up again at his 13-year-old daughter Jenny's skating practice without being invited. Jenny's coach, Vicki Ann Ayers, once again noticed their odd observer. Vicki later said, "I thought that it was weird he was again in the same spot and not moving around or interacting with anyone. It's like 4 degrees in there, and he was only dressed in a jumper." At that point, John had most likely already decided to kill his 2 youngest children. His plans were very likely already in place. He began enacting those plans on June 25, 2018, when he called Avis Car Rentals and booked a rental for a large sedan from Monday, July 2nd through Saturday, July 7th. On June 26th, John contacted a mobile information technology specialist, asking for help transferring files to USB drives, erasing information from his laptop, and deleting his hard drive. the technician came to John's house on July 3rd and helped John complete the requested tasks, as well as installing a program on John's new computer that deleted browser history and temporary files. John picked up his rental car, a white Holden Commodore sedan, on July 2nd. 2 days later, on Wednesday, July 4th, 2018, John drove to the St. Mary's Indoor Shooting Center and collected his 2 handguns, the 9mm Glock and the Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. Later reports indicated that John was flustered during his visit to the shooting center. At one point, he closed his locker door so hard that it jammed, and the center's building site foreman had to use a screwdriver to fix it. All of John's diabolical planning was leading up to the events of the following day, which was exactly 1 week before John's 68th birthday and 2 days before school holidays were to begin. At 7:30 a.m. on Thursday, July 5th, 2018, 36-year-old Olga Edwards drove her 13-year-old daughter, Jennifer, to the train station for school, where she had no idea she was saying goodbye to Jenny for the last time. Olga then returned home, woke up Jack, and drove him to school at about 8:50 a.m., also unwittingly bidding her 15-year-old son their final goodbye. From there, Olga went to work at her job as a North Shore solicitor. At about 10:15 that morning, John Edwards visited his friend, Peter Foreman, at home and handed him a large envelope with 2 envelopes stapled to the outside. John said to Peter, "If anything happens to me." Peter later said his understanding was that he was not to open the package. During the day, John went to the home of his former partner, Ms. C., who wasn't home at the time. He dropped off several boxes and her wooden chest, which he had held onto for over 30 years. At about 3:15 p.m., John left his home in Normanhurst, a suburb of Sydney, for the last time, driving away in his rental car. With him, he had his Glock pistol, at least 2 10-round magazines of ammo, and, in the passenger side footwell, a brand new wrecking bar, which is similar to a crowbar. He likely brought this with him in case he had to break into the house. At about 3:30, John parked his rental car in the parking lot of the Pennant Hills Hotel, which had a direct line of sight to the Pennant Hills railway station next door. At 4:44 p.m., John watched his daughter, Jenny, get off the train and hop onto a bus. John pulled out of the parking lot and followed the bus until Jenny got off at the Mount Street stop, a short walk from the home, at 4:50 p.m. Already familiar with Olga's schedule, John knew his children would be home alone when they got home from school that day. Jack had already arrived home by that time and was playing Fortnite on the computer in his bedroom. As Jenny arrived home on foot at 4:59 p.m., John pulled into the driveway, got out of the unfamiliar rental car, and chased Jenny into the house. She dropped her backpack and laptop bag near the front door and ran down the hallway to Jack's bedroom, throwing herself into the fetal position under his desk. Jack, ever the protective older brother, covered his baby sister with his body. John was right behind Jenny. He walked into the bedroom and fired 10 shots at his children as they huddled under the desk. When the magazine was empty, John replaced it and continued firing. Police later found 14 cartridge cases and located 7 fired bullets. When his terrible deed was done, John turned and left the house. According to a neighbor's CCTV footage, John Edwards was on the property for a total of 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Neighbor Bruce Wilson was having a cup of tea on his veranda and watching the sunset when he heard an almighty bang from the Edwards rented house. He approached the house, confronting John as he left a few minutes later. "He sort of half skipped down these stairs, then he walked towards me, and I thought, I've got to concentrate on his features and his height, because I think he has shot the children." As John got into his rental car, Mr. Wilson asked him, "Is everything all right?" John didn't answer, instead backing out of the driveway and driving away. Mr. Wilson walked up the steps to the front door, which was wide open, but couldn't bring himself to go inside the house. He could see Jenny's green backpack and laptop bag just inside the door. He yelled into the house, "Is everything okay?" but got no answer. Mr. Wilson later said, "I went up to the front door and I sort of braced myself for a while. It just felt so demonic, so bad, such an eerie feeling of standing there." He then spoke with the Edwards' next-door neighbors, one of whom was also concerned that the loud noises they heard might have been gunshots. Both also noticed that the family's dog, Max, hadn't run out the open front door, which he normally did when the door was left open. At that point, Mr. Wilson called the police at 5:20 p.m. At 5:22, the call was broadcast over police radio. Between 5:34 and 5:36 p.m., 5 police officers responded to the Edwards home on Hull Road, noting the open front door, Jenny's bags sitting near the door, no external lights on at the house, and no lights on near the front, although it did appear a light was on near the back of the house. Several officers entered through the front door, calling out, "Police!" They received no answer. They saw an umbrella and a mobile phone on the floor in the hallway. Jack's bedroom was the third door on the left side of the hallway. Leading Senior Constable Keynes opened the bedroom door and yelled, "Police!" The light was on, and she saw a computer on a desk to the left of the door, but she didn't see anyone. Police returned to the kitchen, where they found the family's black and white border collie, Max, trembling and cowering in the corner. They searched the backyard and the shed, then returned to Jack's bedroom to conduct a more thorough search. At 5:40 p.m., Senior Constable Skinner entered the bedroom, turned on the light, and noticed Jack's Fortnite game still playing on the computer monitor. An officer noticed something under the desk, and S.C. Skinner saw a hand between the desk and the wall. Looking under the desk, he discovered the 2 teenagers huddled. Jack lay face down in a protective position on top of his sister Jenny, who was still in the fetal position on her knees. S.C. Skinner felt for a pulse, but quickly realized that both children were dead. At almost exactly the same time that police were discovering the bodies of her children, Olga arrived home from work. She was stopped at the front door by leading S.C. Keynes, who had just heard S.C. Skinner called out that he had found the children. When Olga saw the police officer at her front door, she asked, "What are you doing in my house? Why are you here?" She saw Jenny's backpack at the front door and asked if her house was broken into. She tried to call both of her children's cell phones and received no answer, and then she left a voicemail for John. At 5:55 p.m., paramedic Adam Bollinger entered the house and soon declared both 15-year-old Jack John Edwards and 13-year-old Jennifer Angel Edwards deceased. Meanwhile, Olga was speaking with neighbor Bruce Wilson, who told her he heard 4 gunshots and called the police. Frantic, she told police that she knew her estranged husband John was involved, adding, "We have the final court hearing in 2 weeks." She told S.C. Mansfield repeatedly, "It was my husband," begging to know why she couldn't go into her house. At about 6:12 p.m., Sergeant Michael Berg arrived on scene. He had the heartbreaking task of giving Olga the news that both of her children were dead. When she heard this, Olga collapsed, and neighbors quickly surrounded her. Police set up a roadblock at Dean Street and Hull Road, where a group of concerned neighbors gathered. One neighbor approached Olga outside the house just after she learned her children were dead. The neighbor later said, "I said, 'Are you okay? What's going on?' She said, 'My ex has come and killed my children. He has killed my children. Our court settlement day is in 2 weeks. This is so fucked up.'" Olga spent the next hour making several phone calls, one of whom was to Peter Foreman, who told her that earlier that morning John had just come to say hi. She told police, "Peter is John's best friend. He saw him this morning. He thought it was weird. John never shows up out of the blue." Peter later said that John had alluded to knowing where Olga and the kids lived, although police were never able to determine how he obtained that information. Olga was treated for severe shock at the scene and spent the night in the hospital, after which she was released into the care of friends. As a result of their father's actions, Jack and Jenny Edwards had suffered from traumatic injuries that were incompatible with life. 15-year-old Jack had died from multiple gunshot wounds. An autopsy would later find a total of 19 gunshot wounds, both entrance and exit, on Jack's body, most of which entered in the front and exited from the back, although 5 entered Jack's back and exited the front. Jack also suffered a contact entry gunshot wound on his left forearm, which means the gun was touching his arm when that bullet was fired. 13-year-old Jenny's cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds to the head, chest, abdomen, and extremities. Counting entrance and exit wounds, Jenny had 31 gunshot wounds from 16 separate shots. According to New South Wales Police Acting Assistant Commissioner Brett McFadden, the scene was harrowing for first responders, who arrived after receiving several reports of shots fired. He said, "The emergency service personnel responded to what can only be described as a horrific scene inside those premises." Police believed the children's murders to be a domestic incident. "We consider this to be very much a targeted incident, and we do believe that it may well be domestic violence related, and our focus at the moment is on the investigation to locate our person of interest. Our heart goes out to the family that are coming to terms with the death of these 2 young children." NSW Ambulance Inspector Kevin McSweeney said that when paramedics arrived on the scene, they walked into an extremely distressing and stressful situation. The family and emergency services personnel who responded were provided with support. Of Olga, Mr. McSweeney said, "She didn't sustain any physical injuries as such. However, obviously, because of the horrific scene, the stress is enormous to her. You've really got a family that's going to be struggling to come to terms with it, but also the responding police will struggle to come to terms with what they've seen." I'll take a moment to hear a word from my sponsors. Meanwhile, John Edwards arrived home at around 5:12 p.m. on Thursday, July 5, 2018. Very shortly after executing his 2 youngest children in cold blood. Just after 6 p.m., John put the muzzle of his .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver into his mouth and fired a single bullet, which entered the back of his throat, exited the back of his head, passed through the bedroom wall, ricocheted off the living room ceiling, and smashed through a window, landing in the driveway. Police pieced together the timing of John's suicide based on a statement from a neighbor who sometimes stopped by John's house to walk the dog, Jade. Just after 6 p.m. on July 5th, the neighbor walked down the driveway and around the back of the house to see if Jade was there, which she was in the backyard. As the neighbor walked around the side of the house, he heard a loud bang that he thought sounded as if a big tree branch had fallen on the roof, and he saw dirt and debris fall from the roof of the middle floor. Feeling creeped out, the neighbor went home, returning at about 7:40 p.m. to take Jade for a walk. When he brought her back at about 8:30 p.m., he saw broken glass on the ground and a hole in the side window. At about 7:30 p.m., independent of the neighbor's observations, police began to surveil John's house, which continued overnight. Finally, at 6:18 a.m. on July 6, 2018, the New South Wales Police Tactical Operations Unit, or TOU, looked in John's bedroom window and saw him sitting on the bed. They monitored him for 10 minutes and came to the conclusion that he was dead. When they entered the home at 6:30 a.m., they found John's body sitting upright on the right side of the bed, legs outstretched, shirt covered in blood. His Smith & Wesson revolver rested in the crook of his arm, containing 5 unfired rounds and 1 fired casing. John Ian Edwards, age 67, a certified financial planner for 37 years and the father of 9 children, was pronounced dead. On a set of drawers nearby, police found John's Glock pistol, which he had used to murder his children. In his top left pocket was a piece of paper, on which were printed Jennifer's afternoon movements and a train timetable. Police never determined where that paper came from or how he found out where they lived. On the desk in John's study were a bunch of family law documents. More were found in folders in the same room, and court orders were shoved into the driver's door pocket of John's gold Nissan Patrol 4-wheel drive. Also on the desk in the study was a post-it note that read, chillingly, "Justice delayed is justice denied." If that's not sick enough, in a visible spot in the home, John had laid out a T-shirt reading, "World's Best Dad." In the garage, police found a toolbox that contained burned, shredded documents, a burned Windows tablet with a broken screen, and a cell phone. Police opened the envelopes John had given to his friend, Peter Foreman, who handed them over after hearing about what happened. In one envelope was a key. In another was John's last will and testament, written in September of 2017 and naming Jack and Jennifer as beneficiaries, indicating he did not plan to kill them when he wrote the will. And in the largest envelope were several smaller envelopes addressed to a number of people, including John's former partners, children, and friends. One envelope contained $5,330 Australian dollars in cash for one of John's former partners. Each envelope contained a personalized suicide note. Acting Commissioner McFadden gave a press conference that morning.
In the early hours of this morning, a police operation was conducted in Harris Road at Normanhurst, where the body of a 68-year-old male was located. He was located deceased, and suffering from a gunshot wound. At this stage, an extensive investigation into the circumstances is being conducted. Extensive range of support services are being provided to the family, which is having to go through this horrific experience of losing 2 children at the hand of another. We had a focus overnight to identify and find the person responsible for the homicide, and we've achieved that endeavour by locating the 68-year-old man deceased. What we do know is the 15 and the 13-year-old are natural siblings. The 68-year-old male that was located at Normanhurst is the natural father of the 2 children. A 36-year-old woman attended the scene suffering from significant shock, and I can't even imagine the stress and the heartache that she's going through, but she is the natural mother of the 2 children that were located inside the house. Again, our focus is on the investigation, acting in the strongest possible terms for the interests of the 2 children, to put the matter now well before the coroner. What we do know is that 2 handguns were recovered from the scene at Normanhurst, and we're of the belief that they're the same weapons that were used in the commission of the offence at West Pennant Hills.
McFadden also said,
"It is a horrific homicide. This is a most traumatic incident. The 68-year-old male was the holder of a number of firearms. The 2 handguns were registered in his name, came into his possession lawfully this year."
He said John was known to police, but what they knew of him was from
many, many years ago. We have knowledge of this person, but it's not extensive, and there is nothing that I would say would be contemporary.
He said they knew that John had been engaged in different relationships over many years, and that John and Olga had been involved in
some custody hearings over the past 2 years. The nature of the relationship, particularly in recent times, and the level of access that the 68-year-old had to his children is subject to investigation.
McFadden notified the public that this was a
planned attack
by the children's father. They were home alone and tried to hide in a bedroom when their father barged into the house, carrying 2
quite powerful handguns.
McFadden said this was a
heinous crime. When you prepare yourself as a police officer, you prepare yourself to deal with the most tragic of circumstances, but nothing can prepare you to walk into a home and see 2 children in that state. I managed to speak to some of the police involved. They had a role to play, and they did it well.
Student Leadership Council at Jack's school, Pennant Hills High School, posted on Facebook that their
hearts broke
upon hearing the news.
Today we found out that one of our students was taken from us too soon. Our deepest condolences go out to any students, friends, family, and teachers that are affected by such heartbreaking circumstances and such a devastating event.
Some Pennant Hills High School staff were in tears as they addressed the
somber day
at an assembly for all the students. Students at both kids' schools received counseling on Friday, and it would be available through the school holidays as well. Neighbors in Normanhurst said John kept to himself.
He was a strange guy. He never said hello. We would wave, but that's it. He was very antisocial.
Another neighbor said,
I reckon I had 2 conversations with him in about 20 years. I've seen that photo of him in the media where he's smiling. I don't think I ever saw him smile.
Neighbors who knew John told the media that he was a
strange and unhappy man
who
never had a kind word
for his children.
Poor Jack probably copped the brunt of it. He never had a kind word for those kids. He was very harsh,
said one long-term neighbor. Another neighbor who knew the family for 15 years said of the custody battle,
it was a real mess,
adding that John was
very, very distressed
about it and had mentioned suicide before to several neighbors.
If he had killed himself, it wouldn't have surprised me one bit.
Australia's Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Turnbull, said of the Edwards murder-suicide,
this is a heartbreaking crime. 2 children killed, murdered, it appears by their father, who has subsequently taken his own life. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. Our hearts just go out to the mother and to all of the family, and we mourn the loss of those young people. And just pray that those who have been so hurt in this, by this shocking crime, can find comfort in prayer and the consolation from friends and loved ones.
Rosie Batty is an Australian media figure whose former husband murdered her 11-year-old son, Luke, at cricket practice in 2014. She has since been an outspoken campaigner against domestic violence. Rosie told the media that she empathized with Olga.
You have a 13-year-old girl and a 15-year-old boy, siblings, who've been shot dead in a clearly highly barbaric, frightening manner by their father. And their mother has come home to be greeted with this reality. How the hell do you recover from that?
On Saturday, July 8, 2018, Jack and Jenny's grieving mother released photos of her children to the media. ABC News Australia also released pictures of many bunches of flowers left outside their home in memory of the children. Some mourners grew emotional as they paid tribute. By this time, a Facebook group for Russian speakers in Australia had created a GoFundMe campaign to raise money to fly Olga's mother to Sydney and help Olga with other costs. More than 650 donors managed to raise funds of almost $45,000 to help Olga, who was currently in a great distress and will probably be out of work due to shock and bereavement for some time. After the shooting, questions arose about why John was allowed to have firearms. He was rejected from gun clubs, and police confirmed he had a history of domestic violence. Simon Chapman, emeritus professor of public health at Sydney University, told ABC News,
"The incident that we've just seen, and the one in Margaret River, one in Davidson and one in Wagga a few years ago, all domestic killings, these should be the Port Arthur moments for gun reform in this respect." In Canada, when you apply for a gun licence, it's obligatory that the licensing authorities will interview your spouse or wife or partner, also anyone that you have been married to or living with in the past 2 years. I think anybody knowing what can happen, as is happening in Canada, that these processes are available, they're easy to implement, would say, well, why aren't we doing it in New South Wales, in fact, all over Australia?
The public and politicians on both sides started talking about possible gun law reform. Australia is famous for its tough gun laws. Even so, in 2018, there were between 120,000 and 160,000 legally owned handguns, mostly in private homes, across Australia, over 33,000 of which were in New South Wales. 13,025 people held handgun licenses in New South Wales. It should take at least 7 months to obtain a handgun license. Their tough gun laws stemmed from the Port Arthur massacre, a mass shooting that took place on April 28, 1996, in Port Arthur, a tourist town in the Australian island state of Tasmania. During this event, a 25-year-old man who doesn't deserve to be named, just like every other mass shooter in history, killed 35 people between the ages of 3 and 72 years old, and injured 23 others in the worst massacre in modern Australian history. After this tragedy, the Australian government created heavy restrictions on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, as well as establishing a gun buyback program, a national gun registry, and a waiting period for firearms sales. Since these new gun restrictions were put in place, Australia has had literally one mass shooting. Compare that to America, where as of early May, we've had more than 192 mass shootings in 2023 alone. And that number increased between the time I took notes for this episode and the time I'm recording it. That is a whole different conversation, however, so I won't get into that. The point is, Australia's tough gun laws have been working for the past few decades, and this crime was an aberration committed by a master manipulator who really took his time and planned it out, at the same time pointing out some pretty disturbing loopholes in the law. The media was ravenous to find out how this could have happened, so they dug into John's attempts to join gun clubs, his criminal and domestic violence history, the many AVOs taken out against him, and anything else they thought may be pertinent. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that on his P650 declaration form, some of John's answers raised red flags in the system. On this form, the applicant declares, among other things, whether they have criminal records or mental health concerns, or if they have had an apprehended violence order, or AVO, taken out against them within the past decade. John was subject to a 3-year AVO over 10 years before, but there were no current ones in place against him. Any others that former partners or children had attempted to obtain were ultimately dropped or not pursued for one reason or another. To get a gun license in New South Wales, a person must declare if they have been rejected by other gun clubs. A spokesman for the Kurungai Pistol Club said John tried to join the club, but was rejected, in part because he was aggressive and threatening toward an officer of the club, and in part because of his answers on the P650. As I talked about in the last episode, despite the red flags surrounding John's intense desire to fire and own guns, he was granted a commissioner's permit and was legally able to train at and later obtain a handgun permit and license from St. Mary's Indoor Shooting Centre, which is owned by the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia. The permit reassured officials at the shooting centre that John could legally undergo handgun training, which is the first step in New South Wales toward getting a handgun license and then a permit. To get the permit, he needed 2 character references. He used a friend and his cousin, Michael Edwards, who he told he wanted to get his license so he could take his son, Jack, shooting. After the Edwards murders, Robert Borsak, MP of the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party, told the media,
"With a history like this, there is no way he ever should have been given the commissioner's permit. Whoever did it, whoever it was who did the double check and the triple check on him, somehow failed on this occasion."
He said the NSW Firearms Registry should not have considered John for the permit in the first place.
"They have discretion. They have knocked back many constituents who have come to my office. With his history, they should have knocked him back."
Because of John's past AVO history, the protracted custody battle with his estranged wife, Olga, and his gun club shopping, the registry should have considered John Edwards part of the
worst possible category of someone who is likely to behave like this.
New South Wales Police Minister Troy Grant said that in the wake of Jack and Jenny's deaths, he wrote to Federal Attorney General Christian Porter to
discuss issues associated with improving information sharing between the family law court and state and territory police forces.
He said they wanted to do a thorough investigation and gather all information before making any policy decisions.
It's a complex issue.
Samantha Lee, a spokesperson for Gun Control Australia, said semi-automatic handguns should be outlawed.
It remains the most dangerous anomaly in Australia's gun laws that semi-automatic handguns continue to be legally available for sporting purposes, while the long-arm equivalent were banned 20 years ago because they were considered too dangerous for civilian usage.
In households where domestic violence occurred, she said, gun ownership was even more dangerous.
It is the person who has the key to the gun safe that is of the greatest concern. Current laws do not sufficiently protect women and children from gun violence because it is all based on whether an AVO has been instigated, instead of whether the women or children are at a risk of harm.
This is absolutely true in America as well. I'm going to include a link in the show notes to the Gun Violence Archive, which tracks all American deaths due to gun violence. According to the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, over half of all intimate partner homicides in the U.S. are committed with guns. A woman is 5 times more likely to be murdered when her abuser has access to a gun. In this case, John didn't go after Olga directly. Instead, he went after the 2 people whose loss would devastate her the most, their 2 children. Just when New South Wales thought the situation surrounding the Edwards murders couldn't possibly get worse, it did. On Wednesday, December 12, 2018, Olga Edwards, Jack and Jenny's mom, failed to return a routine phone call, prompting a wellness check. 5 months after the deaths of her children, in the same home where Jack and Jenny died, police found the body of 37-year-old Olga Edwards. She had taken her own life. A spokesperson for the NSW police said,
"Before 10 a.m. today, emergency services were called to a home on Hull Road in West Pennant Hills following a concern for welfare report. The body of a 37-year-old woman was located deceased. The death is not being treated as suspicious, and a report will be prepared for the coroner."
One senior police source said that although they believed no one else was involved and that Olga was clear-headed when she died, the actions of John Edwards had everything to do with her death. The source said,
"This was a slow murder."
Detective Superintendent David Waddell said Olga's death was a
tragic set of circumstances. Our police have been investigating the murders since July 5th this year, when they responded to that address and found the 2 children deceased, and just after 10 o'clock today, they went back there, the same home.
He said Olga had support from her community, but
unfortunately, things took their toll. There are no suspicious circumstances. We will put a brief together for the coroner, and that will form a part of the investigation that commenced in July. There are police who have had involvement with the investigation, and some of them are very personally attached, and they are feeling it today, as are the family and wider members of the public.
Neighbors said Olga had been withdrawn and deeply depressed since the children's deaths, and that she wouldn't leave her home. Her mother had come from Russia to stay with her since the murders, although earlier in the week she had returned to Russia. Olga had promised her she would pack up the house and return to Russia in the new year. Olga was attending counseling 3 times a week, and neighbors were checking in on her regularly.
Every day she would sit inside the house with the blinds down. We'd take her food, but sometimes she wouldn't answer the door. She would sometimes fall asleep in Jack's or Jen's bed at night. She couldn't get over never seeing them again.
One of Olga's friends told the media,
"Life was too hard without Jack and Jennifer. Olga was in heavy counseling, struggling to cope. She was dreading Christmas without the kids and planned to leave Australia for good. She had organized to spend Christmas Day at the house to be close to Jack and Jennifer."
I'll take a moment here for another word from my sponsors. In 2020, several hearings were held at Lidcombe Coroner's Court as part of an in-depth coroner's inquest into the deaths of Jack, Jennifer, and John Edwards, overseen by State Coroner Magistrate Teresa O'Sullivan. This type of inquest is an investigation by a coroner into the circumstances surrounding a death, how it occurred, who bore some or all responsibility for it, and what system failures allowed it to occur. The coroner then issues recommendations based on the findings of the inquest, which in this case were released on April 7, 2021. The inquest examined how domestic violence complaints were treated by police in the Edwards case, what information the firearms registry could access in the police database, how information was exchanged between the registry and gun clubs, and how the registry decided if someone was fit to hold a gun license. It also took a good hard look at independent children's lawyer Debbie Morton, who was appointed to represent the Edwards children in the custody proceedings Olga initiated in 2016. From what I can tell, and of course I'm no legal expert, but based on everything I read as well as everything reported in the media, Ms. Morton essentially bullshitted her way through her testimony at the inquest, saying she had no idea there were any allegations of abuse for the first several months she served as Jack and Jenny's ICL. As she had the whole time she supposedly represented the kids, in front of the coroner and the court, she mischaracterized, misrepresented, and minimized everything, twisting the details to cover her own ass. The coroner largely refused to accept or believe a great deal of Ms. Morton's evidence. She never specifically stated it in the inquest documentation, but it's more than clear that Coroner O'Sullivan thought Debbie Morton was 1,000% full of it. I can't disagree with that assessment. Ms. Morton told the inquest that she read Olga's initial affidavit and a notice of risk that listed John's violence toward the children. She had also subpoenaed police records during the court proceedings. The file included details of an AVO that John's adult daughter, JC, took out against him in 2011, but Ms. Morton didn't think that necessarily meant he had a history of violence toward his children. She told the inquest,
"The daughter applied for an AVO because John turned up at her doorstep wanting to see his grandchildren, and she didn't want him to see his grandchildren. The complaint wasn't that he had caused physical harm to her, but he was an annoyance and wanted him to go away."
In previous evidence, however, the inquest heard that JC was terrified after John stalked her while she picked up her child at daycare. I'll get into that incident a little later in the episode. Catherine Richardson, SC, counsel assisting the inquest, said to Ms. Morton,
"On no view could someone reasonably read that incident and form the view that it just involved a grandfather being a mere annoyance."
Ms. Morton said,
"I knew it was relevant, but it was historical."
Right, because the past never repeats itself. The child-inclusive memorandum the family court received during the custody battle included a statement from Jack saying he didn't want to see his father because of the violence. Ms. Richardson, SC, asked Ms. Morton,
"Do you recall Jennifer said she didn't want to see her father for similar reasons? That he gets very angry and he mistreats her pets?"
Ms. Morton said,
"I do."
Ms. Morton testified that she lost her notes from her initial meeting with the kids in December of 2016, but she remembered that Jack was keen to see John and Jennifer was more ambivalent. Ms. Richardson, SC, said that was
surprising when the evidence is that every other person they spoke to in the process, every therapist, family consultant, there is at least 4 or 5 separate health professionals connected to the family court proceedings, they have told their father was violent towards them.
Ms. Morton responded,
"I wouldn't have recommended they spend a couple of hours with their father if they had said anything to me that indicated that it was not in their best interests."
That's just a flat-out lie, because that is exactly what she did. Also, in December of 2016, Ms. Morton told the family court during an initial hearing,
"The mother has not been very cooperative with respect to family therapist."
However, Ms. Morton had already by that time received a letter from the family therapist recommending they stop attending family therapy because of the allegations of violence. Even so, in May of 2017, Ms. Morton wrote to Olga's lawyer that if Olga continued to be uncooperative in getting the kids to therapy with their father, she would have no other alternative than to recommend the children be placed with their father. Jack and Jenny refused to attend any of their scheduled visits with John. They only went to one for 15 minutes, reluctantly, when they were forced to by a therapist. Ms. Morton said,
"The mother wasn't taking them to the changeover point. She was telling them to take themselves."
Because of Ms. Morton's seemingly relentless campaigning to force Jack and Jenny to see their father, in June of 2017, Judge Jeffrey Monahan mentioned in court that he was frustrated the Saturday visitation hours weren't being adhered to, saying he didn't see anything to suggest Jack and Jenny, ages 14 and 12 at the time, shouldn't see John other than they
don't want to go. I think Mom can try a bit harder, frankly.
I'm sure it didn't help that, as the inquest heard, Ms. Morton didn't bring up any of Olga and the kids' allegations of John's violence at the initial court hearing. In fact, Ms. Morton simply failed to disclose John's domestic violence history to the court and described his vicious treatment of the children as heavy-handed parenting. The inquest also heard evidence from David Brown, the principal of the law firm where Olga worked, who represented her in family court. He said the kids were reluctant to see their father and that Ms. Morton characterized the police reports of previous violence as heavy-handed parenting. Ms. Morton was unhelpful. I have a very clear impression that she was going to drive the children into John's hands, that he had a right and so forth, and she didn't put too much emphasis on allegations of assault. Mr. Brown described John, saying,
"He was a man who burst into tempers, and I think he drank a lot."
He said things were
thrown and broken.
And by the time the marriage broke down, Olga was sleeping in a separate bedroom with the children to avoid physical confrontation with John. Mr. Brown said Jack suffered
almost daily incidences of serious physical abuse.
During one incident, Mr. Brown said, John threw Jack to the ground and kicked him.
There were so many instances where the father had altercations with his son because the son had shown no respect for his father, with good reason, I should say.
He described John as a bully, saying Olga and the kids were afraid of him.
Jack was keeping a cricket bat in his room to protect himself, and Jennifer was scared to turn her back on him in case he hit her.
Peter Fowler was the barrister who represented Olga during the divorce. A barrister is a type of lawyer who specializes in courtroom advocacy. Mr. Fowler told the inquest that John kept a large machete under his bed. Of a previous partner, Mr. Fowler said John
made verbal threats to her he would kill the children's mother because she had taken the children away from him. That's something Olga heard once a year throughout the relationship. That bore on her mind.
Mr. Fowler also said he had no doubt that if Olga knew John was granted a gun license, she would have taken additional steps to protect herself and the children. The family psychologist, who had seen the family from 2017 through April 2018, also gave evidence during the inquest. During her sessions with the family, they individually described John's violence, mostly toward Jack. She said that based on what the family told her, the violence toward Jack included a
clip over the ear,
a kick to the
fleshy part of his bum,
beating and slapping him until his nose bled, pinning him to the wall by the throat, and bending his pinky finger backward. After hearing all of these stories, she said, she realized that John was lying to her about his violence. The kids told her they no longer wanted to see their father, and she felt Debbie Morton didn't listen to their concerns. At one point, Ms. Morton had claimed the therapist agreed to a plan for Jack to live with John if Olga didn't comply with the visitation schedule. The therapist testified,
I would never agree to the children being restored to him. If I didn't feel they were safe enough to be in a joint session, how would I feel they would be safe living with him? I never felt Jack was safe with John.
She even told Ms. Morton she felt John was
more dangerous than he appears,
but asked her not to tell him because
I feared his retribution on me.
The inquest heard that less than 3 months before murdering his kids, John spent 90 minutes in a refresher course to brush up on his shooting skills. The former St. Mary's official who acted as the instructor testified, saying that on April 23, 2018, John fired up to 100 rounds of ammunition at the St. Mary's Pistol Club.
He wanted to become more accurate and stop spraying. I can remember him telling me that.
Another former St. Mary's official said,
At the time of joining, we had no idea he went to other clubs and was refused. It would be helpful if all the clubs talked to each other as well, but there's no portal. We do it off our own bat.
As for why John was allowed to access his lockers when his membership had expired 4 days earlier, the official said he was within his 30-day grace period.
We would not ask anyone where they're going or what their intention is with their firearm. No one would ask me about the safe storage at my home.
Other witnesses gave evidence about John's awful behavior toward the teachers at both of his kids' schools. Jennifer's teacher said John was
very angry and very aggressive,
demanding she give him information about his daughter. The inquest heard about how, after Olga took the kids and left John in 2016, John visited Hornsby Police Station to report that Olga was probably going to make
false accusations
against him so she could
win custody
of the children. 9 months later, Olga filed a police report alleging he had been violent towards the kids. She told them about the time John kicked and punched 13-year-old Jack for touching his phone, the time he hit Jack for playing near a stack of CDs, and the time he slapped Jennifer on the face after yelling at her and telling her to go to sleep. Because of John's preemptive strike, the police didn't believe Olga's claims. Instead, Senior Constable Brooke Cooper wrote in the police database,
"Police do not hold fears of safety, and are of the belief that this may be a premeditated attempt to influence some future family court and divorce proceedings."
At the inquest, S.C. Cooper admitted she shouldn't have dismissed Olga's complaint and probably should have spoken to the children and actually investigated the claims. The family's general practitioner, Dr. Karen Oswald, testified that Olga was
very concerned about the clashing between John and Jack.
She also told the doctor about John's controlling behavior.
She told me that he liked her to wear skirts, preferably short skirts, and to keep her hair very long.
Olga's last visit to Dr. Oswald was in July after the kids' deaths. She told the doctor she stayed in the house where they died to feel close to them.
She would make the beds every day. She was sort of keeping the normal routine going in the house every day as if they were there.
Dr. Oswald wrote in Olga's file about the appointment,
"Reason for visit, extreme distress."
Before she died, Olga herself provided a statement to the inquest. She wrote that John controlled every aspect of her life, even her clothing. She said,
"If I didn't wear a short skirt and high heels to go shopping, he would walk out of his office and say, 'You know what I want.' I would have to go and get changed and have my hair out so I could go to the shops. I was worried about making John more angry. I was always walking on eggshells."
Olga feared that John would
do something
to her, but
had no idea he was capable of doing this to the children.
She told of a terrifying incident that took place in February of 2017. She was attending her usual 6 a.m. hot yoga class, sitting in the darkened room when the instructor turned up the lights. In the mirror, she saw that John, who she'd never seen in a yoga class before, was sitting behind her, staring at her. Olga got up immediately and whispered to the instructor, Oliver Campbell,
"My ex-husband is here and I need to go."
She went straight to the Hornsby police to make a report, saying she was
really freaked out and scared.
But this report didn't show up in the police database search that was shared with the firearms registry. The yoga instructor also provided evidence during the inquest hearings about the stalking incident, saying that Hornsby police didn't take it seriously and instead believed John when he told them he was a long-term regular at Mr. Campbell's classes. Mr. Campbell told them this wasn't true, and the police didn't attempt to verify that with him. In truth, John had only joined the studio the previous month, while Olga had attended approximately 800 classes there since 2012 or 13. Mr. Campbell said he didn't know who John was when he first noticed him in the class, but knew
he wasn't here for yoga. He wasn't behaving accordingly to decency in the room. He was just a pervert, basically. He was more interested in looking around the room at particular junctions when people were exposed.
After Olga left the class suddenly, John stayed, looking around the room and appearing distracted. Mr. Campbell approached him after the class and said,
"I don't know what you are here for, but you are making people uncomfortable. Please don't come back."
John didn't respond, and Mr. Campbell never saw him again. This was not the first class John had attended, but it was the first time he attended the same class as Olga. He said that after the police dismissed her complaint, Olga called him because she felt unsafe.
She was actually crying on the phone, muddling words. I'd never heard Olga like this. She was saying, "My ex is stalking me and invading my space."
It turned out the police made crucial errors in regard to Olga's various complaints. They didn't classify one as an assault that should have been. They neglected to include the children as victims, and they didn't ask if John had firearms. They also failed to follow up on or investigate multiple complaints. Had these been correctly recorded and investigated, John likely never would have received any kind of gun permit. Now, I'll take another quick sponsor break. Coroner O'Sullivan dug deep into John's relationship history, detailing how John left behind multiple families before marrying Olga, including 6 partners and 9 children in total. Police interviewed 5 of the former partners, all of whom told them about John's constant pattern of violence. 3 of them, plus John's adult daughter, had taken out AVOs on him. Only one, from 2000, ultimately stuck. The others were dismissed in court. 5 of the partners and 3 of the children had reported him for domestic violence. One woman was so afraid of John after they broke up that she changed her name and moved to Queensland. Most of these women and some of their adult children testified during the inquest hearings. John's adult daughter, JC, testified, calling her father a
narcissistic psychopath
and describing his anger toward her when she was a child. JC recalled a manic John running a cigarette lighter along the coffee table, yelling at her nursing mother,
"Should I set fire to the whole house? Is that what you want me to do?"
At one point, John also literally used his feet to kick young JC out of the car before kidnapping her younger brother. Police were called, and officers went to John's home and returned without the boy. She said,
"He managed to say all the right things and convince them he had rightful custody."
After her mother left John, JC said, court-ordered time spent alone with John was
not fun.
Their mother was so worried he would abduct them that the family had an abduction plan, which was drilled into the kids' heads. She taught them how to make collect calls from a payphone so they could escape if he kidnapped them. JC testified that she had cut off contact with John when she was 17, but in 2011, she took out an AVO against her father after he had someone hand-deliver a letter to her. The letter said, in part, that his friend had
offered to spend some of his spare time trying to find out for me just when you might be at the Westfields.
She and her husband were selling her home at the time, so she sent her real estate agent a photo of her father, and the realtor confirmed that John had visited her home under a false name during an open house, at which time an agent found him in one of the children's bedrooms, looking at pictures and certificates on the wall. John had also requested a private viewing of the home, but fortunately, that hadn't taken place. JC testified,
"I can't even begin to describe how physically ill that made me."
A few days later, when she was dropping her 3-year-old off at preschool, John stepped out from behind a large gum tree. John approached her, and she opened the window a crack to tell him she was going to the police. Then she locked the doors and sped away.
"I knew my father had a history of abducting some of my siblings. I knew if he wanted to hurt you, he would hurt you through your children. I actually feared for my daughter's safety in this moment more than my own."
When she got home, she found a note from her father in the mailbox urging her not to take out an AVO. One line read,
"I think you need to give me a little respect for the fact that I don't hassle you."
She requested an AVO anyway. During a court hearing regarding that AVO, the prosecutor leaned over to her and whispered,
"He is your father. Can't you just sort this out amongst yourselves?" To which I replied, "You do not know my father."
Before that AVO could be finalized, JC ended up moving overseas, so the order lapsed. JC said she never thought John
would be capable of killing someone. I was shocked he would have taken his own life because to John, he was the most important person in the world. For a long time, I had a hard time believing he killed himself.
2 days after Jack and Jennifer's deaths, JC testified, Olga texted her, writing,
"I just don't understand how they gave him a gun license, especially after your AVO. I will never understand that."
JC told the inquest she felt sad and guilty that she survived their father, while Jack and Jennifer didn't.
John Edwards was never fully held accountable for his actions. He spent 50 years traumatizing the women and children in his life without remorse.
JC, who got to know Olga a little after Jack and Jenny's deaths, testified that Olga carried tiny urns in her purse, one pink, one blue, containing a portion of her children's ashes for 5 soul-destroying months before she died. Olga asked JC to hold the urns. There was hardly a dry eye in the courtroom as JC testified.
"When I did, I wept, not only for my siblings, but as a mother, feeling Olga's immense grief in my hands. I didn't know them, but in many ways I did. They were other versions of us. They have lived with John. I know what that meant. We were bonded by that alone. Their mother loved them so much, just like our mothers. She was the last one, the one to bear it all. A lifetime of his anger, pent up and unleashed.
After Olga's death, her Russian mom invited JC back to the house to take some mementos.
I can still see her smoothing the imprint of Olga's body from Jack's quilt.
JC's mother, Ms. C, saw herself in Olga, telling the inquest,
I was a young, naive 17-year-old when I met John Edwards. The emotional, physical, and monetary impact has been the same. He made our lives hell. You had to live it to really understand that someone could behave the way he did. He also hoodwinked so many people right to the end.
She described how he fought her in family court for 11 years, hoping she would lose her job.
In the end, he won. He got to keep everything and was allowed to see the children who he had treated so appallingly. He was not going to be told by anyone what he could do and couldn't do.
Over 30 years later, she said, she still suffered from PTSD, although John's death brought her some relief.
After 40 years of constant fear, I drove off in my car, and I didn't have to check my rear vision mirror to see if I was being followed.
John's first wife, Ms. A, testified,
He was not particularly good-looking, but he was charming and would bewitch you. Then he turned.
Another former partner told the inquest that John
loved to control his children until they were disoriented and suffering from anxiety to this day.
Even 25 years after their relationship, she said she was afraid to answer the phone or go certain places, and remained paranoid about keeping her door locked. Another of John's former partners testified,
He was not the good bloke who lived next door. He was not, as he claimed, a victim of the family court system.
2 former partners gave evidence that John threatened to kill them, and one said he gave her rat poison. One of John's sons told the inquest that the whole family had come together as
survivors of homicide. It does not deter us. It has not defeated us. Our bond is loving, strong, and close.
The inquest also uncovered the fact that police found a suicide note John wrote. It was saved onto a USB stick at 2:16 p.m. on July 5, 2018, less than an hour before he left his house in a rental car to follow Jenny home from the train station. In the letter, he blamed Olga for the murders, writing,
Olga, you may scream out, what has John done? When the reality is, what has Olga done? None of this had to happen had you been a halfway normal person.
As you can tell based on the fact that he addressed at least part of the letter to Olga, he had no intention of killing her. His intent all along was to take away what was most precious to her and leave her alive to suffer their loss. In April of 2021, at the end of the inquest, the emotional state coroner, Teresa O'Sullivan, had to stop to compose herself several times throughout the hearing in which she announced her findings, while family members in the gallery wept. She found that there were multiple crucial, serious, and systemic failures by the NSW police, the firearms registry, and Ms. Morton, the independent children's lawyer. She made 24 recommendations in her 270-plus page report. The inquest found that a
wholly inadequate
NSW firearms registry failed by granting licenses to John Edwards. The police failed by incorrectly classifying Olga's report of violence against the children as a domestic violence, no offense detected entry, and failing to include John's name in the right field on the report about the yoga class stalking, which meant any future search of his name wouldn't bring the report up. This was part of the reason he received his gun licenses when he shouldn't have. As for the ICL, Ms. Morton, the coroner said she failed by misrepresenting the facts and circumstances to family court. The coroner said that John spent at least a week planning the murders of his children. She paused, struggling with her emotions, while describing how Jack and Jennifer tried to hide from their murderous father under Jack's desk. She mentioned Olga's death as well, saying,
The circumstances of Olga Edwards' death were not the subject of this inquest. Nevertheless, it is appropriate that her tragic passing is acknowledged in these findings. A separate coronial investigation, diligently undertaken by Constable Lee Ryan, conclusively indicated that Olga had taken her own life. As there were no related systemic issues connected to her death, it was not necessary for an inquest to be held. Whilst Olga made every effort to overcome the tragic and unbearable loss of her children, she was not able to envisage a life without them. Whilst the immediate cause of her death is clear, it is important to acknowledge that it occurred against a background of sustained domestic and family abuse, and in the aftermath of a violent crime perpetrated by the father of her two beloved children. It is difficult to imagine the pain that Olga felt when she returned home from work on 5 July 2018 to find police at her home and that her two children, whom she loved dearly, had been killed. This moment was the crystallization of the fear she had harbored as a victim of domestic abuse, as the mother of two children who had been the victims of domestic violence at the hands of their father, and as a wife and mother involved in protracted, acrimonious family law proceedings. The deaths of Jack and Jennifer serve as a stark reminder of the broader systemic problems that face too many women and children every day.
She concluded the inquest by saying,
"The deaths of Jack and Jennifer are an unimaginable loss. It is most distressing that they were both lost at such a young age, with their potential still unfulfilled, and in such violent circumstances. It is common within this jurisdiction to describe such deaths as a tragedy. It is unquestionable that their deaths, and the subsequent death of Olga, have caused unbearable suffering for many family, friends, and all those whose lives they touched. However, to describe this as a tragedy is to import a sense of inevitability, that nothing could have been done to change the outcome. Instead, the evidence before this court plainly reveals that the deaths of Jack and Jennifer were preventable."
With that, Coroner O'Sullivan closed the inquest. Soon afterward, the New South Wales Police accepted responsibility for Jack and Jennifer's deaths. Police Commissioner Mick Fuller said in a statement,
"The systems, processes, and people let Jack, Jennifer, and Olga Edwards down. For that, I am sorry. We have to take responsibility for their deaths. John Edwards should have never got access to firearms. As the NSW Police Commissioner, I need to make sure that can't happen again. Whilst we have made significant changes to the systems and processes, 15 recommendations made primarily for the NSW police force have been rectified."
In 2020, 60 Minutes Australia released a segment about John Edwards, calling it License to Kill. During the segment, John's ex, Stacey, who was known in the inquest report as Ms. D, spoke to the reporter Tara Brown.
"If the police had have told me this man's applied for a gun license, I would have told them, don't give it to him. I have no hesitation in knowing that he could kill someone."
Stacey described the incident in 1998 that led to her AVO against John.
I went through the front door. The front door was deadlocked, and I was thrown into a wall and over a heater, pushing, throwing, pulling hair, telling me I'm going to die.
So that must be absolutely terrifying.
It was beyond terrifying, and I did not think I was going to come out of that house alive.
What made you fear for your life in that moment?
Because he told me that he had a gun, that he was going to kill me. He told me that I wasn't going to go and be with someone else. Those things were not going to happen. I was down on the road, and I was thrown to the footpath and dragged up to the front door, which is just here.
Right, okay, that's a long way.
A very long way. When I ran into the police station, I was screaming with injuries and cuts and ripped clothes, and I said, he's going to go to my house and he's going to kill my family. And they dispatched 6 police cars straight to the address.
Police reassured Stacey he would go to jail. But at trial, she says it was her character that came under attack. And police lost the photos of her injuries from that night. Without that evidence, the case was thrown out.
I'm the one person in 1998 who could have put him in jail. And had he been in jail, no gun registry, no police officer, nobody could have ignored Olga or any other woman who came to them for assistance.
The episode also quoted John's other exes describing various incidents of torture, saying things like,
"Bashed me up, badly and frequently. John pinned me down to the bed and slapped my face. A vindictive and dangerous individual. Whipped ass with a cattle whip. Dad belted him multiple times."
John's cousin, Michael Edwards, also spoke.
We just couldn't believe that what had happened.
What surprised you about it?
Well, John idolised his children, and we couldn't imagine that he would have shot them.
Jennifer and Jack came down here to visit you?
They did. We took them up the snow.
Yeah.
And we had lots of fun, actually. He was so happy. He said, I couldn't be happy. I've got a beautiful wife, 2 kids. And
Were they happy?
I believe so. You know, I've never seen them unhappy.
Michael was one of the family members who received a suicide note from John. When asked if it provided any insight, Michael said,
He said that he didn't want that evil woman bringing his children up. He just couldn't stand it, and he was basically at the end of his tether.
The vengeance in his act, I mean, he didn't kill Olga to protect his children from this so-called evil woman. He killed the children.
Yeah. Can't understand it.
Can you forgive it?
No, I don't think you could ever forgive him for killing his kids. No matter what, you know.
60 Minutes also spoke with Police Commissioner Mick Fuller.
So how did it happen? Why did it happen?
The systems, the processes, the people let Jack and Jennifer and Olga down, absolutely, and I am sorry for that. For mine, the most important one was making changes to the firearms registry so people like John Edwards will never get firearms lawfully again, and we have achieved that by the start of 2019.
Does it cause you some embarrassment, some shame, that it took the deaths of those children for those reforms to be in place?
As the Commissioner, and I'm the gatekeeper for the Firearms Act, yes, it does. Now I've got to take responsibility for that, but I changed the leadership immediately. We changed the structure to ensure this can't happen again. But will I have regrets about these deaths? Yes, I will. We spend an enormous amount of time trying to ascertain the truth in these matters. Now, we can't always.
In the case of Olga going to the local police station to report violence against her children, there was no attempt to find out who was telling the truth. There was no follow-up with the children. She was written off.
Absolutely.
They chose to believe John Edwards.
I agree. And again, I'm eternally sorry for that.
How different would the outcome have been if police took Olga's allegations against John Edwards seriously? How different would the outcome be today?
He wouldn't have got access to a firearm, and that's key. But the reality is New South Wales Police and I as the Commissioner need to accept responsibility for all the failings. The photos of the kids and Olga, those are etched in my mind forever.
I'll pause here for one last sponsor break. Rosie Batty, who I mentioned earlier in the episode, befriended Olga soon after the children's funeral. They bonded over their similar circumstances. She told ABC Australia,
"When you've had a child murdered by the father, there's very few people that really understand and can feel that pain."
She said families like hers and Olga's faced a risk that was constantly undermined.
"It's incredibly dangerous. It's a system that's been broken and flawed for a long time. When we have this kind of tragedy and fatality, and all the facts are laid bare, we see that that should never have happened. And yet, you have to work so hard on being believed and to keep yourself safe. This is not how it should be, and yet so many families find themselves in this situation."
Rosie said she was devastated, but not surprised, when Olga took her own life.
John Edwards didn't murder Olga, but he may as well have put a gun to her head. What he did was more cruel because he knew he'd taken away the most important things in her life and left her to suffer, just like Luke's father did to me. It's the ultimate act of power and control.
Haley Foster, CEO of Women's Safety NSW, told NCA Newswire that the Edwards case
shows all of the massive failings in the system, but they are not one-off incidents. They are not rare occasions. The sort of failings we saw in this case, we see every day.
She said significant moments in family law cases are, just like the time of separation, dangerous times with heightened risk of violence. A lot of John's behavior after the separation, including the post-it note reading, "Justice delayed is justice denied," and a reference he made in an email to "my abducted children," is typical of the abusive perpetrators in the family court system. Most people using violence and abuse in relationships actually identify as the victim, as the aggrieved. Olga wrote in her affidavit way back in April of 2016 that she feared,
"One day I would come home and find my child dead because John could never control his temper."
Ms. Foster said the family law system prioritizes contact over risk.
If the person using violence or abuse is getting messages somewhere in the system that they are aggrieved and they should be able to expect more, that can enliven him. It can make him feel more entitled to continue to pursue his rage. If he is starting to get stopped in the system, there can be a backlash effect.
She said a new initiative that required judges to undergo family violence training was a good start, but she felt lawyers, report writers, and everyone involved with the family law process should be specially trained in perpetrator behavior, the impact of violence and abuse, and other such topics.
When we have actors in the system that don't have that understanding, or that hold problematic or archaic views around gender roles and expectations, then we have a very dangerous situation where the abuser can be given dangerous signals about the course of entitlement they are proceeding with. In this case, everything went wrong, and it did result in a homicide. There are many factors why someone might escalate to homicide or not. But the reality is, many women currently are unprotected in situations where there is that serious risk. And they can't at the moment consistently rely upon police and the courts to keep them safe. At the moment, the offense of stalking, you have to have the intent to cause fear or physical harm, and that can be a really big sticking point. The law needs to catch up and start to realize that ongoing surveillance of any form is unacceptable, and it forms that pattern with other types of conduct, like social isolation or degradation or assault, intimidation. Those sorts of things combined really is the common experience of domestic abuse victims.
She said that criminalizing coercive control, an umbrella term that covers things like emotional and financial abuse and controlling behavior, could help to protect women. In Australia, 1 woman every week is killed by a violent, controlling male she knows. I'm happy to report that in November of 2022, NSW Parliament passed the Crimes Legislation Amendment Coercive Control Act of 2022, making coercive control in current and former intimate partner relationships a crime. According to the law,
the offense occurs when an adult engages in a course of conduct of abusive behavior that is intended to coerce or control the other person.
The law will most likely go into effect in June of 2024. The house where Jack, Jenny, and Olga died sold in July of 2020 for 1.1 million Australian dollars. The new owner received approval from Hornsby Shire Council to demolish the house and build a new 2-story home with attached secondary dwelling. One of the coroner's final recommendations in the inquest was
that the Office of the Legal Services Commissioner investigate whether any disciplinary action ought to be taken against Ms. Debbie Morton in connection with any aspect of her role as the ICL in the family law proceedings between John and Olga Edwards.
Fortunately, in March of 2020, Debbie Morton was removed from Legal Aid NSW's panel of independent children's lawyers that are assigned to represent kids during family court proceedings. A spokesperson for Legal Aid NSW told The Guardian Australia that when the agency removes a lawyer from a panel,
it is because Legal Aid NSW is no longer satisfied that the practitioner reaches the requisite standard for membership.
It turns out the Edwards children weren't the only kids Ms. Morton failed. In November of 2019, the family court allowed an appeal of a federal court decision from 2 months earlier regarding an order to remove 2 children from their father and place them into the care of their grandparents. In that case, titled Raider and Raider, Ms. Morton was the ICL for the 2 children, who were traumatized by their removal from their father. The appeals court's judgment was critical of the federal court judge for implementing that order, as well as of Ms. Morton for recommending it, saying that the drastic order should not have been sought by the ICL or made by the judge. The court ordered the children to be returned to their father's care. A lawyer representing the Raider family, Lisa Flynn, said,
"What this family has been through is devastating. 2 children are suffering severe psychological trauma, which our client believes could have been avoided had the independent children's lawyer appointed by Legal Aid acted differently."
In December of 2020, after Ms. Morton gave her self-serving evidence at the coroner's inquest, 4 complaints were lodged against her. In a case unrelated to the Edwards inquest, a law firm was independently investigating taking civil action against Debbie Morton in regard to an allegation of
professional negligence.
Because the matter is related to family law proceedings, no further information is available. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any decisions regarding Ms. Morton being punished or not within published decisions of the NSW Civil and Administrative Tribunal. It does, however, appear that Ms. Morton may still be practicing law. She does still have a valid practicing certificate from the Law Society of NSW, and on the website for her practice, Morton Family Lawyers, she is listed as the principal, as well as the only lawyer under the Our People tab. Ms. Morton lists her credentials on that page, also mentioning the following.
Debbie was previously a member of the Legal Aid Commission of NSW's panel of independent children's lawyers and regularly appointed to represent the best interests of children in parenting disputes.
Of course, she doesn't mention anything there about being kicked off the panel or the complaints against her. I'd like to end this episode telling you everything I've been able to find out about Jack, Jenny, and their beautiful mama, Olga. Olga was popular among her co-workers, and she was an incredibly loving, doting, protective mother who would do anything for her kids. Jack and Jenny both had dark brown hair and beautiful brown eyes, just like their mom, although Olga later cut her long hair and dyed it blonde. All three shared a very strong family resemblance. Jack John Edwards has been described as free-spirited, active, headstrong, and endearing. A teacher who knew Jack since he was in year 1 described him as a
cheeky, very lovable child.
His friend, Sean Allen, said Jack was
always kicking the ball around.
Jack was fiercely protective of his mom and sister and had looked forward to meeting his many half-siblings, which was planned after the family law proceedings were over. Jack was in year 10 at Pennant Hills High School and played for the Pennant Hills Demons AFL club as well as the Westbrook Juniors. The AFL is the Australian Football League, and Australian football is somewhat like American football, played with a similar oval-shaped ball. Jack also loved playing computer games. He maintained a strong sense of connection with his school friends. Jennifer Angel Edwards was in year 8. One of her teachers at Gosford High School on Australia's Central Coast described her as a
kind and gentle
girl who had a long commute but was nonetheless excited to be accepted into a selective school. A selective school is a school that admits students based on some kind of selection criteria, usually grades. Jenny was very good in school and was a very bright girl. She was quieter and more reserved than her brother. She loved reading. One teacher said she would
spend hours and hours being lost in literature.
Jenny loved animals and wanted to be a veterinarian. She had a few pets, including her 18-month-old Netherlands dwarf rabbit, Oreo. She had an Instagram account where she documented her bunny's life, including its friendship with her black and white border collie, Max, and her parakeet or budgie, Sunny. She let Oreo roam free in her bedroom. He had his own little bed and a whole drawer to himself. This very short clip is from one of the videos on her Instagram account.
Oreo, come.
Jenny's friend, Peggy, said of her,
she always had a laugh with us every day.
Jenny loved ice skating. Her skating coach described her as a
great kid, super smart, funny,
and a talented skater. If they were alive today, Jenny would turn 19 this summer. Jack would be turning 21 this fall, and Olga would be 41 now. I've seen so much of myself and my kids and our former situation in Olga, Jack, and Jenny, and researching this case has been even more difficult than most. I'm so grateful my story didn't end the way theirs did, but as soon as I heard their story, there was no way on earth I wasn't going to put my all into telling it as comprehensively, respectfully, and honestly as I could. Rest in peace, Olga, Jack, and Jenny Edwards. You will forever be in my heart. My sources for this episode were ABC News Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian Australia, Kidspot Australia, The Australian, news.com.au, NCA Newswire, the NSW government website, the Daily Telegraph, the West Australian, 60 Minutes Australia, the Morton Family Lawyers website, the Gun Violence Archive, the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, and an inquest by the Coroner's Court of New South Wales. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.